Chapter 1: The Island. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. And it has been told in another book called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe how they had a remarkable adventure. They had opened the door of a magic wardrobe and found themselves in a quite different world from ours. And in that different world, they had become kings and queens in a country called Narnia. While they were in Narnia, they seemed to reign for years and years. But when they came back through the door and found themselves in England again, it all seemed to have taken no time at all. At any rate, no one noticed that they had ever been away, and they never told anyone except one very wise grown-up. Okay, so basically when they were in the wardrobe, time goes by very, normally in Narnia, but in the real world, that's only a very short amount of time. So in the previous book, they had been in Narnia for years and years. They had reigned as kings and queens as adults. And then when they went back through the wardrobe, back to the real world, they found that really almost no time had passed, and they went back to being kids again. That had all happened a year ago, and now all 4 of them were sitting on a seat at a railway station with trunks and play boxes piled up around them. They were, in fact, on their way back to school, just like many of you were recently. They had traveled together as far as this station, which was a junction, and here, in just a few minutes, one train would arrive and take the girls away to one school, and in about half an hour, another train would arrive, and the boys would go off to another school. The first part of the journey, when they were all together, always seemed to be like part of the holidays. But now, when they would be saying goodbye and going different ways so soon, everyone felt that the holidays were really over, and everyone felt their term time feelings beginning again. And they were all rather gloomy, and no one could think of anything to say. Lucy was going to boarding school for the first time. Okay, so this is kind of describing how we normally feel when the summer vacation is over and we have to go back to work. While this year was a little different and we were maybe a little more ready to get back to normal than usual, but typically there's a bittersweet feeling of not wanting summer to end, but also excited to get back to normalcy. It was an empty, sleepy country station, and there was hardly anyone on the platform except themselves. Suddenly, Lucy gave a sharp little cry, like someone who has been stung by a wasp. "What's up, Lou?" said Edmund, and then suddenly broke off and made a noise like, "Ow!" "What on earth?" began Peter, and then he too suddenly changed what he had been going to say. Instead, he said, "Susan, let go! What are you doing? Where are you even dragging me to?" "I'm not touching you," said Susan. "Someone is pulling me. Oh, ow! Oh, stop it!" Everyone noticed that all the others' faces had gone very white. "I felt just the same," said Edmund in a breathless voice, "as if I were being dragged along. A most frightful pulling. It's beginning again." "Me too," said Lucy. "Oh, I can't bear it." "Wait, look sharp," shouted Edmund. "All catch hands and keep together. This is magic. I can tell by the feeling. Quick!" So he's telling them all to hold hands because he can feel like magic is about to make something happen. "Yes," said Susan, "hold hands. Oh, I do wish it would stop. Oh!" Next moment, the luggage, the seat, the platform, and the station had completely vanished. The 4 children, holding hands and panting, found themselves standing in a woody place. Such a woody place that branches were sticking into them, and there was hardly even room to move. They all rubbed their eyes and took a deep breath. "Oh, Peter!" exclaimed Lucy. "Do you think we can possibly have got back to Narnia?" It might be anywhere," said Peter. I can't see a yard in all these trees. Let's try to get into the open, if there is any open." Okay, so when he says I can't see a yard, he's not talking about like your backyard lawn kind of thing. He's talking about I can't even see a few feet in front of me because there's so many trees around us. Let's see if we can find an area that's a little more clear, not quite as foresty. With some difficulty and with some stings from nettles and pricks from thorns, they struggled out of the thicket. Then they had another surprise. Everything became much brighter, and after a few steps they found themselves at the edge of the wood, looking down on a sandy beach. A few yards away, a very calm sea was falling on the sand with such tiny ripples that it made hardly any sound. There was no land in sight and no clouds in the sky. The sun was about where it ought to be at 10 o'clock in the morning, and the sea was a dazzling blue. They stood sniffing in the sea smell. "Oh, by Jove," said Peter, which we know from our vocabulary, this is a kind of like an exclamation. "This is good enough." 5 minutes later, everyone was barefooted and wading in the cool, clear water. It would kind of be like magically arriving in the Bahamas or in Jamaica somewhere with beautiful beaches, and they're like, well, I'm absolutely going to go play in the water. "Oh, this is better than being in a stuffy train on the way back to Latin and French and algebra," said Edmund. And then, for quite a long time, there was no more talking, only splashing and looking for shrimps and crabs. So Edmund makes the remark that, yeah, this is way better than going back to school, and I think I would have to agree. "All the same," said Susan presently, "I suppose we'll have to make some plans. We're going to want something to eat before long." All right, so one thing I want to note here, Susan is always the responsible sibling. She's always thinking ahead, always looking out for everyone. So it makes sense that she's the one to point out and say, hey, this is fun and all, but we're going to have to start thinking about, what are we going to do long term? Because we're all going to be hungry here in just a little bit, and there doesn't seem to be any restaurants or really any people of any sort around. "Well, we've got the sandwiches Mother gave us for the journey," said Edmund. "At least, I've got mine." "Not me," said Lucy. "Mine were in my little bag." Remember, they left their bags on the bench at the train station that disappeared. "So were mine," said Susan. "Mine are in my coat pocket there on the beach," said Peter. "That'll be 2 lunches among 4. Oh, this isn't going to be such fun. What he's saying is, of the 2 sandwiches that we have, we're going to have to split them amongst 4 people. It's not going to be a whole lot of fun because we're all going to be real hungry here in a little bit. "At present," said Lucy, "I want something to drink more than I want something to eat." Everyone else now felt thirsty, as one usually is after wading in salt water under a hot sun. "It's kind of like being shipwrecked," remarked Edmund. "In the books they always find sprigs of clear fresh water on the island. We'd better go and look for them." Okay, so Edmund here is a little bit of a dreamer. Okay, he's like, oh, they always find fresh water in the books and movies, so that's sure to happen in real life too, which we know is not always how real life pans out. "Does that mean we have to go back into all of that thick wood?" said Susan. "Not a bit of it," said Peter. "If there are streams, they're bound to come down to the sea, and if we walk along the beach, we're bound to come to them." Peter, okay, this brings us to a little more characterization here. Peter is the sibling that he's obviously the oldest. He's in some ways the most mature, but he's often the problem solver, okay? So Susan says, oh, if we have to go look for some fresh water, we have to go back into those woods and search for a stream or something, right? I don't want to do that. And Peter says, wait, no, we don't. If there are streams on the land, they have to flow into the ocean somewhere. So if we just keep walking along the beach, eventually we'll find some streams. They all now waded back and went first across the smooth, wet sand, and then up to the dry, crumbly sand that sticks to one's toes, and began putting on their shoes and socks. Edmund and Lucy wanted to leave them behind and do their exploring with bare feet, but Susan said this would be a mad thing to do. Not mad as in angry, but mad as in silly or crazy. So this would be a silly thing to do. "We might never find them again," she pointed out, "and we shall want them if we're still here when night comes and it begins to be cold." Once again, we see Susan planning ahead. She says, no. It might be fun to run around and explore without shoes on, but it's going to get cold later tonight, and you're probably going to want them. It's not like we're coming back here. And if you leave him here, you may never find him ever again, because we're not exactly sure where we are. We might get lost. When they were dressed again, they set out along the shore with the sea on their left hand and the wood on their right. Except for an occasional seagull, it was a very quiet place. The wood was so thick and tangled that they could hardly see into it at all, and nothing in it moved. Not a bird, not even an insect. Makes you wonder what's going on in this woods if nothing is moving and nothing is living, so to speak. Shells and seaweed and anemones, or tiny crabs in rock pools, are all very well, but you soon get tired of them if you are thirsty. Eventually, the children stopped caring about all the fun things they were finding and really only wanted to find water. The children's feet, after the change from the cool water, felt hot and heavy. Susan and Lucy had raincoats to carry. Edmund had put down his coat on the station seat just before the magic overtook them, and he and Peter took it in turns to carry Peter's greatcoat. So they're having to lug everything they had that was on them when they got there, and they're getting a little weary of all this traveling. Presently, the shore began to curve around to the right. About a quarter of an hour later, after they had crossed a rocky ridge which ran out into a point, it made quite a sharp turn. Their backs were now to the part of the sea which had met them when they first came out of the wood, and now, looking ahead, they could see across the water another shore, thickly wooded like the one they were exploring. Okay, so let me see if I can give you a little mental picture of what we're seeing here, okay? So let's say this is where this little dot right here on my screen that I just drew in blue is where the children first came into this land, okay? We know they came up on a beach, okay? Well, as they keep walking around this way, okay, they're traveling. Now they get to about right here. They've been walking all day, and they see way across the water another land, okay, that looks like it's very similar in nature to what the land they're on right now. And Lucy says, I wonder if what we are on is actually an island, okay? She's like, I wonder if the land that we are on actually curves around and doesn't attach to this land, to the other land across from us at all, or if maybe back this way, the land actually connects, okay? And maybe there's just a big bay or something right here in the middle, okay? So trying to figure out, I wonder, A, how do we get over there? And then B, are we connected to it or are we just on our own island here? Okay, that's kind of what she's talking about here. Let me clear this screen so I can keep going. Hello. It's not letting me do it all at once here. All right, maybe I'll just get it off this way. Sometimes it gives me a button where it will clear the screen in just one click, and apparently right now it's not wanting to do that. So, okay. I wonder, is that an island, or do we join on to it presently? Said Lucy. Don't know, said Peter, and they all plodded on in silence. The shore that they were walking on drew nearer and nearer to the opposite shore, and as they came around each promontory, or part that sticks out, kind of like this, okay, each point, the children expected to find the place where the two joined. So every time they came around the bend, they kept thinking, oh, we'll see where this land connects to that land across from us. But in this they were disappointed. They came to some rocks which they had to climb, and from the top they could see a fair way ahead, and, oh, bother, said Edmund. It's no good. We shan't be able to see to those other woods at all. We're on an island. So they did finally confirm the two lands did not connect. And it was true. At this point, the channel between them, or the body of water between them, and the opposite coast was only about 30 or 40 yards wide, but they could now see that this was its narrowest place. After that, their own coast bent around to the right again, and they could see open sea between it and the mainland. It was obvious that they had already come much more than halfway around the island. Okay, so again, back to my picture here. All right, so here's the island they were on. They've now walked around enough to see that, okay, this is actually an island, all right? And the land across from us that we saw looks something like this, okay? This little cross section here, that's the skinniest point, all right? If they keep going this way, it's only going to get wider and wider the more they go, okay? So they're currently the closest to the land opposite them right where they are, but they're still not exactly sure how to get there. It's not like they brought a boat with them or anything. "Look," said Lucy suddenly. "What's that?" She pointed to a long, silvery, snake-like thing that lay across the beach. "A stream! A stream!" shouted the others, and as tired as they were, they lost no time in clattering down the rocks and racing to the fresh water. They knew that the stream would be better to drink farther up, away from the beach, so they went at once to the spot where it came out from the wood. It would be fresher, more clean by the woods, not by the ocean water. It would be more salty and dirty. The trees were as thick as ever, but the stream had made itself a deep course between high, mossy banks, so that by stooping you could follow it up in a sort of tunnel of leaves. They dropped on their knees by the first brown, dimply pool and drank, and dipped their faces in the water, and then dipped their arms in up to the elbow. "Now," said Edmund, "what about those sandwiches?" "Oh, hadn't we better save them for later?" said Susan. "We may need them far worse later on." Remember what I said, Susan's always the one thinking ahead. "I do wish," said Lucy, "now that we're not thirsty, we could go on feeling as not hungry as we did when we were thirsty." All right, let me explain what she means by this. You know how when you're thirsty, all you can think about is how thirsty you are. But then the minute you get something to drink and you quench your thirst, now you all of a sudden realize how hungry you are. Okay? So Lucy says, "Man, I wish we could feel as not hungry as we did when all we could think about is how thirsty we are." "But what about those sandwiches?" repeated Edmund. "There's no good saving them until they go bad. You've got to remember it's a good deal hotter here than in England, and we've been carrying them about in pockets for hours." Which he makes a good point. He says, if we don't want them to spoil, then we can't eat them at all. So they got out the 2 packets and divided them into 4 portions. And nobody had quite enough to eat, but it was a great deal better than eating nothing. Then they talked about their plans for the next meal. Lucy wanted to go back to the sea and catch shrimps, until someone pointed out that they had no nets. Edmund said they must gather gulls' eggs from the rocks, but when they came to think of it, they couldn't remember having seen any gulls' eggs and wouldn't be able to cook them even if they found any. Peter thought to himself that unless they had some stroke of luck, they would soon be glad just to eat the eggs raw, but he didn't see any point in saying this out loud. Susan said it was a pity they had eaten the sandwiches so soon. 1 or 2 tempers very nearly got lost at this stage. So we can see the children are tired. They're starting to get a little bit worried and concerned about not knowing where they are, not having any food with them, and they're starting to argue amongst each other. Finally, Edmund said, "Look here, there's only one thing to be done. We must explore the wood. Hermits and knight-errants and people like that always manage to live somehow if they're in a forest. They find roots and berries and things." "What sort of roots?" asked Susan, not really willing to believe Edmund so quickly. "Well, I always thought it meant roots of trees," said Lucy. "Come on," said Peter. "Ed is right, and we must try to do something. And it'll be better than going out into the glare in the sun again." So they all got up and began to follow the stream. It was very hard work. They had to stoop under branches and climb over branches, and they blundered, or moved about clumsily, that's a vocab word, through great masses of stuff like rhododendrons. Okay, rhododendrons is a really long word. It basically just means really thick tree roots. They blundered through great masses of stuff like rhododendrons and tore their clothes and got their feet wet in the stream. And still, there was no noise at all, except the noise of the stream and the noises they were making themselves. They were beginning to get very tired of it when they noticed a delicious smell. and then a flash of bright color high above them at the top of the right bank. "I say," exclaimed Lucy, "I do believe that is an apple tree." And it was. They panted up the steep bank, forced their way through some brambles, and found themselves standing around an old tree that was heavy with large, yellowish golden apples as firm and juicy as you could ever wish to see. Especially now they haven't eaten all day. They look even better. "And this is not the only tree," said Edmund with his mouth full of apple. "Look there! Oh, and there!" "Why, there are dozens of them," said Susan, throwing away the core of her first apple and picking her second. "This must have been an orchard, long, long ago, before the place went wild and the wood grew up." "Then this was once an inhabited island," said Peter, meaning people lived there. "And what's that?" said Lucy, pointing ahead. "By Jove, it's a wall," said Peter. "An old stone wall." Pressing their way between the laden branches, they reached the wall. It was very old and broken down in places, with moss and wallflowers growing on it, but it was higher than all but the tallest trees. And when they came quite close to it, they found a great arch which must once have had a gate in it, but was now almost filled up with the largest of all the apple trees. They had to break some of the branches to get past, and when they had done so, they all blinked because the daylight became suddenly much brighter. They found themselves in a wide open place with walls all around it. In here there were no trees, only level grass and daisies and ivy and gray walls. It was a bright, secret, quiet place, and rather sad. And all four stepped out into the middle of it, glad to be able to straighten their backs and move their limbs freely. So tomorrow we'll get into chapter 2, the ancient treasure house, and hopefully tomorrow we'll find out where exactly the children are.